Russian forces in Chechnya are reported to have suffered one of the worst setbacks of their recent campaign. Western correspondents say they saw the bodies of at least 100 Russian soldiers who had been surrounded by Chechen rebels. But their reports have been denied by Moscow. Our correspondent Mark Webster reports from inside Chechnya.
For these Russian soldiers out on patrol in Chechnya today, the killings in Grozny will be a huge psychological blow. Full of confidence until now, their early victories had done much to wipe out the bitter defeat of the last Chechen war. That's why a Russian general at first totally denied that an armoured column had tried to storm Grozny's central square. We have repeatedly said, and continue to do so, that Russian troops will not undertake any storming of Grozny. But since it's young conscripts like these who bear the brunt of the fighting, the eyewitness reports of large numbers of Russian dead are plausible. They'd be no match for Chechen veterans. While it's absolutely clear that the Russians do now have the upper hand in this area of Chechnya, they are, as expected, meeting much fiercer resistance in the battle for the Chechen capital, Grozny. During the last conflict in the city, thousands of young Russian soldiers were killed in close-quarter fighting, and Russia's army was forced into a humiliating retreat. This time, as we saw for ourselves only a few days ago, the Russians have ringed the city with heavy weaponry, but stopped short of trying to storm it. Instead, they had threatened to bomb the city and its civilian population into submission. Given the Russians' overwhelming superiority in machinery and men, this defeat is a significant setback. But so much military pride rests on the success of this operation, it won't stop the armed forces pressing ahead. If anything, it'll make the Russian generals more ruthless in how they go about it. Mark Webster, ITN, Chechnya.
Russia launched a three-pronged attack on the Chechnyan capital Grozny today, bombarding it from the air and from the ground. The renewed assault followed a lull in the fighting, during which civilians were again advised to get out. But thousands of people are still in the capital. ITN found its own evidence of the new assault today when our Moscow correspondent Mark Webster traveled deep into Chechnya. He sent us this report.
Security throughout Chechnya has been further tightened as thousands of Russian troops launched a fresh stage in the military operation. Travelling through the village of Achkoy Martan, once a rebel stronghold, we did find life returning to normal for some Chechen inhabitants. But only miles further, this tank blocked the road, swiveling its gun to point directly at our car and make us stop. Those soldiers ordered us back, saying it wasn't safe for us to go any further. From here, the thunder of shells and bombs raining on Grozny, just a few miles over there, is clearly audible. And in those woods, the soldiers said there was a search and destroy mission by Russian soldiers, looking for Chechen militants, who they claimed were launching nightly attacks on Russian positions. Despite those dangers, there is an increasingly large flow of Chechens trying to go home, anxious to see if their houses have survived the fighting. For all of them, it's a desperate journey. These were allowed through one roadblock after hours of waiting, only to be stopped again by the tank. The road may not reopen till Monday. Others are still fleeing the war. We found these 500 people from Grozny living in the gym of a school just inside the Chechen border. They say they came here because Russian officials promised them humanitarian aid. They've received nothing. But they told me things were much worse for those left behind in the city. Grozny's being shelled and people can't leave because they're bombing from all sides. A lot of them are old. Most people are sick. They're hungry and they need medicines. Since Russia's priority is to escalate the war, it seems there'll be no mercy for any civilian caught in the middle. Mark Webster, ITN, Chechnya.
To our Foreign Affairs editor Robert Moore, who is in Moscow. Robert, this fighting comes at a critical political moment for Russia, does it not?
Trevor, absolutely. There's no doubt that this military campaign and domestic Russian politics are very, very closely linked. The polls here for the parliamentary elections, that's for the lower house of parliament, the Duma, open in just 36 hours. The big issue certainly is the Chechen war, which receives widespread popular support. And the big fear here is that any military blunder, as we suspect may have happened in the early hours of yesterday morning, would significantly tarnish the reputation and authority of the government, and in particular of the Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin.
So, Robert, how concerned is Moscow about the international condemnation of its bombardment of Chechnya?
Well, I think as Europe's Chechen envoy said, Moscow is listening but not responding. The foreign ministers of the major powers who have been meeting in Berlin today with Russia have demanded an immediate ceasefire. Now, I don't think we're going to see that. Russia's military objective of capturing Grozny certainly remains intact. But I think, make no mistake about it, the Kremlin here is very much aware of the diplomatic and political stakes being exceptionally high as they go into this crucial weekend of the Russian parliamentary elections.
Robert Moore, thank you.
Russia says it's close to controlling a district of the Chechen capital Grozny tonight after another series of attacks on the city. But Chechen rebels say they've fought off Russian attempts to take key strategic positions. From Chechnya, Mark Webster has the latest.
The thunder of bombs rolled out from Grozny as Russian forces prepared to take the city area by area, reducing it to rubble as it goes. Walking to the edge of the capital with Russian soldiers, we were warned Chechen fighters were still in the area. Spotting some in the distance, there was a brief exchange of fire before the Russians withdrew. I'm now standing on the Russian front line. Zhokar is the name that the Chechens gave to Grozny, a city they still hold in large number. And despite the constant bombing and shelling we can hear around here, it'll still be an extremely hard job and very costly in terms of lives to drive them out. The ruins of this Grozny suburb show how they plan to do it. In the words of the Russian military, it's been cleansed of Chechen fighters in the past few days. Now, among the wrecked buildings, a dead horse lies in a courtyard. Yet amazingly, people have survived here throughout the bombing. The Zaras looked on in bewilderment at the wreckage of their home. There's nothing left, Izmir Zara kept repeating. There's nothing left. Nearby, an awesome array of military equipment stands ready for the task of levelling the city. The 20,000 civilians left inside won't be allowed to stand in its way. Mark Webster, ITN, Grozny.
Good evening. Early results from Russia's parliamentary elections are signalling major changes in the country's political landscape tonight. Centrist parties have made big gains, boosting the hopes of the Prime Minister Vladimir Putin that he'll succeed Boris Yeltsin as president next year. Robert Moore reports from Moscow.
Tonight, the great vote count is well underway. Over 100 million Russians were eligible to vote. It's a huge exercise in democracy, involving 94,000 polling stations. It's only the third parliamentary election since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The man who has gained most politically in recent months is the Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. He's not standing for parliament himself, but support for the unity party that backs him has surged dramatically. Mr. Yeltsin himself is in the final months of his presidency. Tonight there is even speculation that he might step aside early, now that his chosen successor, Mr. Putin, has gained such political strength. In many ways, the vote has been overshadowed by the war in Chechnya, portrayed here as a fight against terrorism. And as Russians voted, so their armed forces continued their assault on Chechen rebels. The stronghold of Grozny is still under heavy air and artillery bombardment. Robert Moore, ITN, Moscow.
Robert, what's the latest on the results?
Well, we're still seeing early indications only in Moscow, and in European Russia the counting really has only begun, but many time zones ahead in Siberia and in the Russian Far East they're making good progress. The early signs are the communists are doing well as expected, and the other story of the night is the rise of the Unity Party. That's the pro-Kremlin centrist group that backs the Prime Minister Vladimir Putin and his prosecution of the war in Chechnya. But for many people, Nick, this is all about a dress rehearsal for the great prize in Russian politics, which is the Kremlin itself, and those presidential elections due in June, just 6 months from now.
And the fighting in Chechnya dominating everything.
It is indeed. There's a lot of links, I think, between the Chechen war and the political calendar. Certainly, the Russians like the tough and determined stance of the government. But if things go wrong, then politically life remains volatile, and certainly it is possible there could be a reversal of fortune for the Prime Minister yet.
Robert Moore in Moscow, thank you.
The Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has received a massive boost in the country's parliamentary elections and to his hopes of succeeding President Boris Yeltsin. Millions of people turned out to vote for the Kremlin-backed centrist parties in what's being seen as a popular mandate for the government's war in Chechnya. Here's our diplomatic editor Robert Moore.
There has been no sight of Boris Yeltsin since he voted yesterday, but the Kremlin tonight has every reason to be pleased at the new political landscape. The votes, once they were counted, revealed the centrist Unity Party has stormed the political heights. It's a pro-Kremlin group created out of nothing, and now it's nearly overtaken the Communists as the biggest party in the new parliament. Some 70 million Russians voted, and now there is the first real chance of the Kremlin and the parliament working together, and that could be a major boost for reformers. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin spent the day in his office. With his parliamentary allies now so strong, he has gained much authority and political strength. He was filmed speaking to Tony Blair, both men exchanging and accepting invitations for reciprocal visits. The Communist Party leader Gennady Zyuganov has launched an attack on Putin, saying he has no policies. But what Mr. Putin does have is a popular war on his hands. Russians widely support their government's attempt to crush the Chechen rebellion, and the conflict in the northern Caucasus has now changed politics across Russia. Much of Mr. Putin's success has been thanks to a Kremlin-organized propaganda battle. A judo black belt, he was seen regularly on state television, always portrayed as tough and agile. In terms of his character and his politics, Mr. Putin remains an enigma. Not surprising given his long past with the KGB. But the astonishing rise of his political allies now makes him the hot favorite to succeed Boris Yeltsin in the Kremlin. Robert Moore, ITN, Moscow.
And in Chechnya this evening, Russian jets and artillery have continued to pound the capital Grozny. In the last hour, Moscow has claimed that it seized control of the civil airport on the outskirts of the Chechen city.
The Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin claimed today that the crisis in Chechnya could be near its end. And there are reports that Russian commanders have been given orders to take the capital Grozny. But as our correspondent Mark Webster reports from near Grozny, the Chechen rebels there are still putting up a fierce fight.
Chechen fighters are still fully in command of Grozny, despite months of aerial and land bombardment by the Russians. Moscow's hopes that these militants would simply leave to escape the shelling have proved utterly unfounded. The Chechen rebels are sheltering underground, eagerly preparing for a chance to engage the Russians if they do try to take the city. These pictures, smuggled out of Grozny today, show images of Russian prisoners paraded before the cameras, may begin to provoke some doubts in Moscow about the conduct of this war. This appears to be the only answer Russia has. More heavy artillery moving into place in the open fields around Grozny. We found teams of young conscripts manning these batteries, which daily rain a deadly hail on the city. After so many weeks in the field, they looked a pathetic sight. They also appeared indifferent or unaware of the terrible effect their shelling has on the civilians still inside the Chechen capital. Though these tank gunners insist that their targets are carefully pre-selected, it's impossible even to see where their shells are landing. And the fact is that at the other end, in the city of Grozny, there are thousands of civilians sheltering in cellars, terrified in case the next bomb which lands hits them. Tonight the guns roared again as the offensive showed no signs of letting up. However, for all the firing, the Russians have failed to advance any deeper into the Chechen-held city for several days. Mark Webster, ITN, on the outskirts of Grozny.
The continuing cost of war in Chechnya.
Russia today launched one of its heaviest bombardments yet in Chechnya to try to capture control of the capital Grozny. Fierce battles are raging on the outskirts of the city. Our Moscow correspondent Mark Webster reports.
Russia's ferocious assault on the Chechen capital followed a huge build-up of its forces in the area. However, despite Moscow's assurances, it's clear that 20,000 civilians still in the city will suffer heavy casualties. The Russian army has tried to minimize its own losses by advancing behind a smokescreen. The Chechen militants are well dug into carefully prepared defensive positions. They believe they can inflict substantial losses The relentless build-up of the Russian forces here inside Chechnya is a measure of their determination to pursue this war. However, since they've made it absolutely clear that they won't storm the capital, Grozny, it will be a war of attrition, bombing and shelling for weeks or even months to come. Mark Webster, ITN, Chechnya.
Russian forces have pushed deep into the Chechen capital Grozny on the second day of their assault for control of the city. They say they're coming up against strong resistance from rebel fighters. Mark Webster reports.
Hour after hour, the Russians continue a merciless assault on the Chechen capital, as Russian generals spoke optimistically of a swift end to this campaign. Claiming that they already made inroads deep into Grozny, the Russians nonetheless accepted there had been fierce clashes with Chechen militants fighting from well-defended positions. Elsewhere, the Russians have begun the task of clearing hundreds of mines laid by the Chechens to slow the Russian advance. All around this area, buildings lie in ruins as the Russian military machine cuts a swathe of destruction throughout the region. Though the Russians have assembled an enormous array of weaponry around Grozny, they say they're not using armoured columns inside the city itself. That's because the memory of the last war runs deep. Here in the centre of Grozny, Russian columns were surrounded and destroyed by the Chechens. Russian generals won't make the same mistake again. Bolstered by success in recent parliamentary elections here, brought about largely thanks to the popularity of this war in Russia, it seems the Kremlin and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin have decided that now's the time to try to end the war in Chechnya. In doing so, they're clearly prepared to ignore a barrage of Western criticism about their conduct of this campaign, put up with substantial military casualties, and show no mercy at all for the thousands of civilians still trapped inside Grozny. What will be seen in Russia as a military triumph will be seen outside as a piece of wanton barbarity. Mark Webster, ITN, Moscow.
The Russians threw more reinforcements tonight into the battle for the Chechen capital Grozny. As ITN's Mark Webster reports, they're continuing to meet fierce resistance from 2,000 or so rebels who are well armed and well dug in.
As the latest Russian offensive on Grozny stalled, fresh reinforcements were on their way this evening to the battle zone. Since the Chechen militants have shown no signs of withdrawing, the Russian onslaught, launched on Christmas Day, appears to have bogged down. With the chance that the rebels may yet get the upper hand, the talk is now of further heavy bombing. Strident early statements from Russian generals that they could take the Chechen capital Grozny within a matter of days have proved to be utterly unfounded. Instead, it's clear again this evening that the Chechen fighters are putting up fierce resistance. Among thousands of civilians caught in the middle, Shamin Bayeva has stood forlornly on the border for 2 days, denied the right to return to her home in Grozny. I have 7 children, and we've been in a refugee camp for 3 months. We're running out of food. Yet another victim trapped by a war they hate. Mark Webster, ITN, on the Chechen border.
Chechen rebels said today they'd retreated from 2 key hills in their capital Grozny, which had been under non-stop Russian bombardment. The Russians claimed the military operation was nearly over, but as ITN's Mark Webster reports, victory won't have come cheaply.
Wrecks of Russian armour lie beside this road inside Chechnya. Clear evidence that all is not going to plan in the Russian campaign. Most were destroyed by mines, but the soldier told me this armoured personnel carrier burst into flames after Chechen fighters on horseback blew it up with a grenade. All 6 soldiers inside died. The very fact that there is this graveyard of Russian military hardware proves that the Chechen fighters have managed some successes, and that's despite the fact that there only seems to have been one serious attempt by the Russians to storm into Grozny. It's inevitable that when they try that again, there'll be many more casualties. So in reply, Russian bombs continue to rain death on Chechen fighters and civilians alike, including the Elikhanov family. Now in hospital, they were trying to flee Grozny when disaster struck. I saw the planes flying around, then suddenly the roof of my house blew off. 7 children were killed, including one of my sons. This year will be full of bitter memories for most Chechens. Mark Webster, ITN, Chechnya. Chechnya.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin surprised the world today as it was waking up to the new millennium by announcing his resignation. His Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin, becomes acting president with his finger on the nuclear button until elections in March. Mr. Yeltsin was due to step down in 6 months anyway, but he said today he thought the end of the old century was an appropriate time to go. Here's our Moscow correspondent, Mark Webster.
Wiping away a tear, Russia's master of the unexpected stunned the world by stepping down 6 months before his term expired. As he handed over the briefcase containing Russia's nuclear launch codes, the departure of the ailing, erratic, but larger-than-life figure was greeted more with relief than anxiety.
Россия должна войти в новое тысячелетие.
Russia must enter the new millennium with new politicians, he said in his familiar slow drawl. New faces, new smart, strong, energetic people. In his place as acting president, the colourless former KGB chief Vladimir Putin is expected to provide continuity. But the timing of the resignation has also set the stage perfectly for Mr. Putin to succeed Mr. Yeltsin as president. Russia's latest war in Chechnya has propelled him from a virtual unknown to the country's most popular politician. Early elections should help him to capitalize on that, despite the terrible suffering of the Chechen people. Now Boris Yeltsin has succeeded in making history yet again by being the first ever Russian leader to step down voluntarily, rather than die or be forcibly removed from office. However, his political legacy remains an extremely controversial one. While he destroyed a moribund communist system, he replaced it with an even more corrupt free market one. His proudest political moment came in '91, when, standing on top of a tank, he led opposition to an attempted communist coup to restore the Soviet Union. But in '93, he tarnished his democratic credentials when he used force to put down another coup attempt by parliamentarians. Leaving his office for the last time, he asked Russians to forgive him for his failures. Whether the people of this impoverished former world power will do so is highly debatable. Mark Webster, ITN, Moscow.
And Mark Webster can join us now live from Moscow. Mark, Mr. Yeltsin has proved controversial.